Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and we are continuing on with the bell curve, going over Chapter 9, Welfare Dependency. Again, continuing on with this section of the book, Part 2, all about social behaviors in American society and how IQ seemingly affects a lot of these social behaviors in American society. If you guys remember from last time, we talked about family matters, all about marriage, divorce, and illegitimacy. Illegitimacy being like having a child out of wedlock. And some of that will be relevant to what we're going to be talking about today. So, all about welfare dependency. Let's just jump right into it. I want to remind you guys, one of the authors here, Dr. Charles Murray, he actually wrote a book. It's called Losing Ground, on how his opinion, welfare, on why it doesn't work and why it feeds. And I don't know this for sure because I haven't read it, but from the synopses and summaries I've read, it's, how welfare, like, basically keeps you on welfare and doesn't allow you to work out of it and then become self-sufficient. I'd have to check on that for you guys, as well as just a caveat that I have not read that book. So Dr. Charles Murray has some experience within this field, within this spectrum of welfare. And now they're going to take a look at welfare in regards to who goes on welfare. Does IQ play a role on your probabilities of going on welfare? So let's start this off. The author started this off with a little historical lesson, as they have done in previous chapters, talking about the AFDC. And what is the AFDC? That is the Aid to Families with Dependent Children. This created in the mid-1930s. Pretty popular idea. It was aimed at helping women who were widowed, so husbands had died, so this AFDC would kind of help them take care of the family, children, and whatnot. It was seen as something that was pretty popular. And also, it was also there for husbands who had walked out on their families as well. But some people had voiced concerns about this program, saying specifically here on page 192, most people thought that they should be helped too, though some people voiced concerns that helping such women undermined marriage. So this is kind of like incentivizing women to be single and collect on this welfare, I think, is what they're trying to say there. I'm not exactly sure. That's kind of how I would interpret that. Let's continue on. Never married women were eligible for the AFDC, and they were a growing proportion of the participants. So this is something that was growing and kept on growing. So originally, it's there for, you had a husband who died. There's something there to help the family out. Now it's for women, they weren't even married. They had children out of wedlock. And now this subset of AFDC is growing and growing and growing. So the original intent might not have been to service this population, so to speak. It was intended for something else, and then it grew into this. And people kind of saw this as like an immorality where why are we kind of supporting this? It's kind of, again, like incentivizing women to be in this position in their lives, and they're going to get money for it. Right? And maybe that's kind of like a very, very basic way to look at it. And some people might be critical on the way that I'm looking at it there, but I think that's kind of what the authors are getting at here. Let's continue on. The authors have this graph, the welfare revolution, and as you guys can see there, from pre-1940, AFDC caseloads as a percentage of families, less than 1%. 0.5%. You're talking about 1935 maybe there. And then you see this huge wave in the mid 1960s. Just look at those trend lines comparing 66 to 75 and then 36 to 66. And you see this emerging trend line from 1990 onwards to right around the time when this book was written there. A very similar trend line comparing 1966 to 1975. So very, very interesting. The steep rise in the welfare population is obviously not to be explained by intelligence, which did not plummet in the 60s and 70s. But there's other fundamental forces that are at play in this time period, reshaping the social landscape. And I'm reading from there on page 193. As of 1992, more than 14 million Americans were on welfare. Again, keep in mind that this graph is only showing this for AFDC. So it'd be interesting to see other welfare programs and comparing AFDC to those other welfare programs. And, maybe the authors bring up a point here about AFDC, but maybe other welfare programs don't have that nearly as much people on it. Possibly. It's something to kind of play a little devil's advocate with the authors here. So IQ and welfare. This is taken from page 193. Women on welfare have less education than women not on welfare. And chronic welfare recipients have less education than non-chronic welfare recipients. So this is going to be kind of the summary, a good jumping off point, as well as a good summary for what we are about to take a look at in regards to IQ and welfare. So the smarter the woman is, the more likely she will be able to find a job, line up sources of support, be farsighted in planning out the future and not making risky decisions here or getting yourself into some risky business. I found it interesting that they were just looking at women here, but I think they chose to do that. And again, it's only white women. It's only white women that they took a look at from the NLSY data. I think it had to do with building off of the things from the previous chapter and illegitimacy and looking at the IQ of the woman in the first year of birth, or excuse me, in the year prior to birth, and then who has a child before marriage and who has a child within the institution of marriage. So now we're continuing that conversation on the woman because that kind of shapes how that child is going to grow up. So somebody who's less smart is going to have a child out of wedlock without a father. We saw those statistics from the previous chapter on that child growing up in poverty. Now that affects the child and it just kind of manifests itself. Remember, we talked about this last time, the compounding interest of out-of-wedlock births and that huge jump. Gosh, what were those years? There was huge jumps in out-of-wedlock births that we were looking at in the previous chapter. Let's take us to the first table here. Which white women go on welfare after the birth of the first child? And you can see here percentage of mothers who went on AFDC within a year of the first birth on the left, percentage of mothers who became chronic welfare recipients. So one thing that I was interested in is what is a chronic welfare recipient? That I wasn't quite clear if it's like, is this the year, 2 years? Or is this somebody who has gone on and off welfare like multiple times in their life? But take a look at this and you'll see similarities between the two sides of the table and the cognitive classes here. And as you go down the cognitive classes, you're getting to people with lower and lower, women with lower and lower IQs. They are more and more likely to go on AFDC or more and more likely to become chronic welfare recipients. The very bright and the bright, not a ton. Not a ton, as you can see. from that table. They extrapolate, or they kind of build on this and take a look at the impacts that IQ has and the probabilities of going on welfare, and comparing IQ and parental SES, those dependent variables, to each other. And there is a note that it kind of got cut off. We're going to go over this graph in a second, but the note is, for computing the plot, age and either SES for the black curves or IQ for the gray curves were set at their mean values, and then additional independent variables of which the effects have been extracted for the plot, like marital status at the time of first birth, poverty status in the calendar year prior to the first birth. So those were not taken into account within this graph. So basically what it's telling you is this is just looking at IQ, and we're holding parental SES constant. We're not even factoring in those other things. We just want to look at IQ. We just want to look at parental SES. That is my interpretation of that note. And again, sorry, I kind of cut it off from the picture here. And as you can see, even after poverty and marital status are taken into account, IQ played a substantial role in determining whether white women go on welfare. Yeah, look at that as it goes from very low to very high standard deviations. As far as the IQ, you're talking about like almost a 40% decrease in the probability of going on welfare. And there is a difference for parental SES, but again, not as strong as IQ. So that's for going on welfare after the birth of the first child. But what about chronic welfare dependency? So they reference this study here on page, this is 196, 197. And they spell out two findings from the 1980s, which is what they constitute as furious political and scholarly struggle over welfare during the 1980s. Okay, so the two findings: average spell of welfare lasts 2 years for all women who go on welfare. So the duration of the time they are on welfare is 2 years. That's average for all women. But for never married mothers who had their babies in their teens, average time on welfare is 8 or more years. So average is 4 times as long. And in their teens is telling me that they are looking at a high school population who probably did not quite finish high school, right? Did not quite finish high school, or maybe got their high school diploma. It's important to note that this portion that they are talking about here is a very, very restricted part of the population of chronic welfare mothers. All right. They say here, to get an idea of how restricted the population of chronic welfare mothers is, 152 white women in the NLSY met the criteria for chronic welfare and also had IQ scores. None of them were in cognitive class 1. 5 were even in class 2. Only 5 had parents in the top quartile in socioeconomics class, socioeconomic status. 1 lone woman of the 152 was from the top quartile in ability and from the top quartile in socioeconomic background. And the conclusion here from this paragraph: white women with above average cognitive ability or socioeconomic background rarely become chronic welfare participants. So let's take a look at the next graph here. Very interesting graphs. Socioeconomic background and IQ are both important in determining whether white women become chronic welfare recipients, but parental SES is more of a predictor. This is one of the very rare graphs that we see in the book where parental SES made more of a difference. And that's not to say that IQ didn't make a huge difference. It still did, like almost 20% decrease in the probability of being a chronic welfare recipient as the IQ increased from very low to very high, right? From going from both ends of the spectrum. But look at that for parental SES. It was almost 40%. Almost 40%. Wow. And they kind of speculate why is this? Why would SES be more of a predictor in this? And they kind of speculated that there is a stigma of going on welfare, but it's a stigma to the parents. So now parents get on you if you are trying to go on welfare. The parents don't want you to because it makes them look bad. Is kind of what they're saying here. American parents having school-age children go on welfare is highly stigmatizing to them. If the daughter of a working-class or middle-class couple has an illegitimate baby out of wedlock while still in high school, chances are that her parents will take over support for the new baby rather than let their daughter go on welfare. Okay. Very interesting. And just a quick point here on education. White chronic welfare recipients are virtually all women with modest education at best. This is really basically like a high school diploma or less here. You're going to see this in this table. Look at this. Educational attainment of white chronic welfare recipients. Look at that. It's almost more than 50%, more than half of the chronic welfare recipients did not even get a high school diploma. Right? GED or less than high school. So most of these women are not going to college. So almost no college graduates are going on welfare. And again, like we said, for women with a high school diploma or more, IQ had more of a factor than SES. Oh, okay. No, we weren't just talking about that. For women with a high school diploma or more, IQ had more of a factor on chronic welfare than SES. That's right. Because for high school or less, SES mattered more. Yes, SES matters more for women who did not finish high school and had an illegitimate child. If only I could read my own slides. Because when I do this with you guys, I have the book up here, and then I have the slides here. All right, let's continue on this this final slide as we conclude here, drawing together the findings. Poor women of low intelligence seemed especially likely to have illegitimate babies. This group is where the welfare system looms the largest. So by loom, I mean they are at more of a risk of going on welfare and staying on welfare, chronic welfare. And again, we'd have to look at really what that term means, chronic welfare. How many years exactly do you have to be on welfare in order for you to then be considered a chronic welfare recipient? We cannot say for sure that higher IQ or education is what keeps college graduates off welfare. So again, virtually from that table, here, let me go to it. Page 199, again from that table, educational attainment of white chronic welfare recipients, almost nobody with the advanced or BA or BS degrees, bachelor's degrees, or higher went on welfare. Almost nobody. But the authors can't say for sure that it's IQ or if it's education or if it's something else. They couldn't say that quite for sure. But for low IQ women with no high school education and becoming chronic welfare participants, low socioeconomic status had more of a predictor in that. And again, we saw that from the line graph. One of the few times where parental SES made more of a difference than IQ. And not to say that IQ didn't make zero difference, but parental SES had more of a factor. And again, because from what the authors had suggested, it's stigmatizing to the parents. makes the parents potentially look bad. And guys, that's going to do it. A very short chapter, this one. We'll have a doozy. The next one, we're going to be talking about Chapter 10, Parenting. That'll be a longer chapter. This one, nice and short. Let me know what you guys think. There will not be an episode next week. I will be out of town, so we'll catch up in about 2 weeks. If you guys listened this far, thank you so much for listening. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions, comments, critiques, please leave them below in the video, in the comments section. And guys, thank you very much. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.